Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Daniel. I work as a director of Infrastructure Adaptation Program in the Intech Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. And in my role, I focus primarily on developing guidelines and standards for flood risk reduction as it relates to new communities, existing communities in Canada, and commercial real estate buildings. As well, I look at the role that natural infrastructure can play in climate adaptation in Canada. Sure, I can give you an example. So I mentioned we work in the area of new community design. So a while back we asked the question, when we are building new residential communities in Canada, how do we make sure that they are built more flood resilient going forward? So we worked with municipal engineers, engineering consulting firms, insurance industry representatives, developers, home builders, conservation authorities, you name it, 100+ stakeholders all across Canada, trying to understand what are the key considerations for new residential community design that absolutely must be taken into consideration to make sure that new residential communities are more flood resilient. And so after consulting with the wide range of stakeholders across Canada, we were able to document 20 best practices for building new low-rise residential subdivisions that are more flood resilient going forward. So essentially, if you're a home buyer and you're selecting which community you would like to purchase your new home at, by buying in those communities that have been designed with these 20 best practices in mind, you are buying a bigger peace of mind every time that it rains. And just to add, Standards Council of Canada has also then supported a creation of a national standard of Canada that CSA Group is now developing for flood resilient community design based on the results of this research. So much like you can have a building certified LEED or energy efficient, going forward you may be able to certify a community flood resilient, and that will send a market signal to the homeowner, insurance industry, mortgage brokers that this community is safer from the standpoint of flood risk reduction. We're doing similar work to develop best practice guidance for existing communities. What can you do within confinement of existing communities to reduce flood risk? And then what can you do in commercial towers to reduce flood risk going forward as well? Right, so let's start with the new community design. Best practice number one is not building new residential communities in harm's way. For example, trying your best not to put residential homes in a floodplain, for example. And you would be surprised, but sometimes it does still occur in Canada. Other things include grading the street in such a way that when it rains, the water flows away from home and towards the right-of-way, so it doesn't flow the opposite way, causing basement flooding or home flooding. Reverse slope driveways are a big concern in low-rise residential communities. So you may have a street at one level and then a driveway that's grading down from the street. When there's a lot of water during extreme weather events flowing on the street, often it rushes just straight down to the garage, causing flooding of the house through that reverse slope driveway. So when we're building new communities, it's better not to put reverse slope driveways in them. And then things like installing backwater valves on sanitary sewer laterals to prevent flooding through surcharge of the sanitary sewer system during extreme rain events. Some municipalities in Canada also require putting these backwater valves on storm sewers as well. So it's things like that for new community design. And for existing communities, some considerations include, for example, that homeowners can get engaged on are clearing catch basins. So some municipalities have come up with programs like Adopt a Catch Basin, where homeowners know which catch basin they're responsible to clear and maintain of debris. So again, when there's a big rainfall event, there's a lot of overland flow on the street. It has somewhere to go and to drain. Disconnecting downspouts, for example, and pointing them away, safe distance away from the home, and hopefully not into your neighbor's house. Yes, so we've began the consultation with industry stakeholders in this space, trying to understand what is already being implemented to retrofit commercial buildings to make sure they're more flood resilient. So we're in the consultation stage right now, talking to commercial building owners, managers, to investment community, to industry associations, to consultants in the space, and so on. But we already have a list of 20 or so best practices that we began to document, just looking at examples of adaptation across Canada. So just to give you a few examples, we had a flood last week here in Toronto where we had a near-death experience. 2 men were trapped in a commercial building elevator, which kept on going down into the basement, which was full of water. So by the time they were rescued, they were standing on the handrails in the elevator, grasping for air. And there were 2 policemen that rescued these men, also risking their life as they were rescuing these men. So one of our best practices that we're developing for commercial buildings includes having sensors on the elevators so they don't continue going down into the flood water, for example. That can prevent human life loss, or elevators automatically returning to a safe elevation, like ground floor or even second floor, in case there is a trigger that triggers such operation. So it's things like that, like practical things. What can you do to retrofit commercial buildings to introduce flood resiliency measures? I think it's the complacency is #1 issue. Sometimes people think that we have the luxury of time to address flood risk. The reality is we don't have the luxury of time. The weather of the past is not a good predictor of the future. There may be folks who think, oh, my house has never been flooded before, so probably I shouldn't worry. Or some folks that have been flooded and they say, oh, it was 1 in a 100-year storm. It will not happen for the next 100 years. That's a huge misconception. With the extreme weather increasing due to climate change, with aging infrastructure, with increased imperviousness due to development, these flood problems are only going to get worse with time. And so every day that we don't adapt, we don't implement flood resiliency measures, is the day we don't have. So I think the biggest hurdle is this misconception that we have a lot of time on our hands to start adapting. We need to start adapting today to address flood risk. Honing on the homeowner question, in our experience, one of the best ways to incite homeowners into action is through direct engagement and direct conversation with the homeowners. So when somebody who is a trusted source, a trained professional, engages with a homeowner to discuss flood risk and also to highlight some highly practical, actionable items that they themselves can do inside and outside of their home to better protect it from flooding. And I think when it comes from a trusted source, such as a home inspector, insurance or mortgage broker, or real estate agent, that is trained to assess flood risk and can provide these recommendations, homeowners will listen and they will take action. So we have great knowledge in the country already in terms of what are these lower hanging fruits are to address home level flood risk. It's that enticement in person that will probably drive home action forward quite effectively. I don't think there's just one. I think there's a number of them. So a while back, we released at the Intake Center a list of top 8 things homeowners can do inside the house and outside of the house to reduce their exposure to flood risk. I'll just name a few examples. So it's installing backwater valves on sanitary sewer lateral and maintaining them during the life cycle of that backwater valve. This is one example. So that prevents sanitary sewer surcharging into the homeowner's basement during extreme weather event or operational failure of a stormwater system. It's clearing catch basins, as I mentioned earlier. It's downspouts, directing them away from the home, so they can discharge safe distance away from the house as opposed to right next to the home, causing seepage into the foundation and flooding as well. It's also making sure that the grading around the house is such that the water, when it rains, flows away from the home and not towards the home. Some homeowners can walk around their house when it's raining, look where the water is pooling, and flag those areas for regrading down the road. And it's also not storing your Picasso on the ground of a basement floor, right? If you have valuables, perhaps don't store them in the basement. If you absolutely must have valuable items stored in a basement, make sure they're lifted off the floor or they are in containers. So if the water does get into the basement, then at least the damage is reduced. Oftentimes we see stories in the news that homeowners lost collections of family photo albums or wedding albums or CD collections. And it's sometimes these items that people really regret losing during time of flood. So if I'm a homeowner who is storing items like that in my basement, I would be right now spending my weekends lifting them off the floor, putting them in sealable containers. I'm glad you asked that, Danielle. Nature can be a strong complement to gray infrastructure solutions when we are looking at flood attenuation. So Intake Center has done has conducted research in the past that looked at one nature infrastructure asset, specifically wetlands, to understand, can wetlands act as a sponge essentially and absorb some of the rainwater in a time of a flood event. And so what we've done is we've selected 2 pilot sites in southern Ontario, and we've modeled a big event, 1 in 500-year rainstorm occurring in the fall in those 2 pilot sites. So one was upstream of the city of Mississauga, a rural pilot site, and another one was upstream from uptown Waterloo, an urban pilot site. And what we've done, we've modeled what does the flooding look like for 1 in 500-year storm in the fall, with and without wetlands in the downstream communities. And we found that flood damages can be reduced by up to 40% when you look at damage avoidance to homes, industrial and institutional buildings. So looking at retail, shops not being flooded out, office buildings not being damaged, and so on. And in an urban center specifically, in uptown Waterloo, every time that, say, you have 1 in a 500-year storm and wetlands are there to absorb that rainwater, we quantified that financial avoidance at over $50 million. So you can see how preserving natural infrastructure, in this case wetlands that are upstream from city of Waterloo, pays every single time that the disaster is avoided. Absolutely. There's quite a bit of work being done in that space. CPA Canada, for example, quantified the value of forest or trees, urban forests in Montreal, and helped the municipality bring that value on books. Other municipalities across Canada working with MNI, that's Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, They have quantified, for example, the value of ponds for storing water during rainstorm events as sort of like a natural tank. So town of Gibsons has done so, and they are bringing that value, or trying to bring that value on their books to justify maintenance of these assets over the long term. Just like a gray infrastructure needs maintenance, natural infrastructure also needs maintenance. And to your point, whether Intact Centre is working on researching this topic further, we are working with Insurance Bureau of Canada, International Institute for Sustainable Development, to develop a methodology for quantifying the total economic value of natural infrastructure assets, whether it's wetlands, ponds, green spaces, for climate adaptation. So you're quantifying benefits like flood attenuation, like drought attenuation, like water quality improvements, habitat creation, aesthetic value. And then you can, using the same methodology, you're able to compare and contrast the net present value of natural versus gray solutions and make investment decisions more holistically. Yes, so fortunately I have not been flooded. I live on the 27th floor of a building that's far away from the flood zone. I did the due diligence check, but some of my friends know somebody who has been impacted. And after hearing me talk about my work so much, sometimes I get texts from friends who own homes that, hey, I've put a backwater valve in my sanitary sewer lateral to prevent the nasty stuff entering their basement in case there's a surcharge. So that's heartwarming to hear. I always ask, make sure you know how to maintain it, right? That annoying person. Somebody recently messaged me saying that, last time there was a flood in Toronto specifically, we also had a blackout in that neighborhood, but they put backup power for their sump pump, so it continued going throughout the blackout. And they said, well, thanks for mentioning that and nagging long enough for us to do it. So far it's kind of success stories, but I've also heard for commercial, people who work in commercial towers, right? I traveled to Calgary, and some folks who worked in commercial buildings in Calgary during 2013 flood, they said they weren't able to access their office for 2 weeks, some people for up to a month. They thought they had teleworking in place to help resolve this problem. Turns out teleworking didn't work so well because it was never tested before. And so just as an example, when that 2013 Calgary flood occurred, it affected downtown core, and so 150,000 people could not access their office buildings for 2 weeks, and that in one time, like over 2 weeks, has costed, in terms of lost labor productivity, $500 million in one go. So hearing stories like this certainly makes our work on commercial real estate retrofits that much more meaningful as well. Yeah, so certainly I visited commercial towers in Calgary that have been impacted during 2013. And I've seen excellent examples where an owner of a commercial building has invested, for example, among many other things that they've done, but one example, they've purchased a Canadian water gate system. So it's a flood barrier system that they can put around the entire city block where their tower is located in under an hour to protect from overland flooding. So it's essentially a system with military-grade certified foam inside that flaps up, creating a wall whenever overland water approaches that city block. And this organization does drills annually to make sure their operational staff is able to put the system around the city block to make sure everybody knows what they're doing. So I think it's a great example of adaptation success story. The company has lived through the flood. They had the entire parkade full of water. Now they've invested into a system that happens to be a Canadian system. They invested $200,000 to protect an entire city block. So it's not just the tower that they own that benefits from this flood protection measure. Is everyone who is located inside city block benefits from this investment. Thankfully not. We haven't had such a big flood yet that they will have to exercise the system, but they're prepared. I think that future home inspectors and flood risk assessors, first of all, must be really proud of themselves for doing this job. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most effective ways to help homeowners take action is to have that in-person engagement with a trusted professional, which home inspector or certified home flood assessor is. We also know that for most Canadians, their home is the largest investment that they will be making in their life. So by helping homeowners, new home buyers, or so people who already own their homes, identify what the flood risk is, help them identify actions to reduce this risk, I think home inspectors and home flood risk assessors have a really noble job. They help these Canadians secure the value of their largest investment in life.